We were having our usual Friday game night when Jake, our 16-year-old, made an announcement that turned our family evening into a confession session none of us expected. The Monopoly board was spread out on our dining room table, and I was winning for once. My husband was grumbling about landing on my property with 3 houses, while our 13-year-old daughter was systematically counting her money for the 5th time. Jake had been unusually quiet all evening, which should have been my first clue that something was brewing in that teenage brain of his. He'd been picking at the corner of a chance card for about 10 minutes, and I kept catching him glancing at us with this weird expression. You know that look kids get when they're working up the courage to tell you they failed a test or broke something expensive. That's exactly what his face looked like, except somehow more intense. The house felt different that night. There was this tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Even our golden retriever seemed to sense it, because instead of begging for the leftover pizza crusts like usual, she was just lying in the corner watching us all with those knowing eyes dogs get sometimes. Jake finally put down his piece and cleared his throat. His hands were actually shaking a little, and my mom instincts immediately kicked into high gear. I knew my son, and I knew when something was seriously bothering him. He'd been more withdrawn lately, spending more time in his room, and I'd caught him staring off into space during dinner conversations more than once. When he started talking, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told us he was gay and had been hiding it for years because he was terrified of disappointing us. The words came out in this rushed, nervous stream, like he'd been practicing them over and over in his head. He said he couldn't pretend anymore and was completely prepared for us to reject him. My heart absolutely shattered in that moment. Not because of what he was telling us, but because my baby had been carrying this burden alone for so long. I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his shoulders were hunched like he was bracing for impact. This kid who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms was sitting there convinced we might stop loving him. My husband and I didn't even hesitate. We both got up at the same time and wrapped him in the biggest hug. I was crying before I even realized it, and I kept telling him over and over that we loved him no matter what, that nothing could ever change that. My husband's voice was thick with emotion too as he reassured Jake that he was perfect exactly as he was. Our daughter, bless her heart, just rolled her eyes and said she'd figured it out months ago from the way he'd been acting weird whenever certain topics came up. She seemed more annoyed that we were interrupting the game than anything else, which was actually kind of hilarious in retrospect. We sat there for what felt like hours, having this deep, emotional conversation about love and acceptance and what family really means. Jake was crying, I was crying, even my husband was getting teary-eyed, and he's not usually the emotional type. We talked about how proud we were of his courage, how sorry we were that he'd felt like he had to hide this part of himself, and how we wanted him to always feel safe being authentic with us. It was one of those moments where everything else just falls away and you remember what really matters. The bills, the work stress, the daily grind. None of it seemed important compared to making sure our son knew he was loved unconditionally. I kept thinking about all the signs I might have missed, all the times he might have been struggling alone, and it made my chest tight with this mix of guilt and overwhelming love. But then something shifted. Jake started getting this weird look on his face, and suddenly he was laughing. Not the relieved, emotional kind of laughter you'd expect after such a heavy conversation, but this mischievous, almost guilty giggle that I recognized from when he was little and had pulled some elaborate prank. That's when he dropped the bomb that completely blindsided all of us. Update 1. Jake wiped his eyes and looked at us with this sheepish grin that made my stomach drop. He told us he wasn't actually gay at all. The whole thing had been a test to see if we would love him unconditionally no matter what. He'd been worried that our love was somehow tied to his achievements or who he was supposed to be, and he wanted to know if we'd still accept him if he was fundamentally different from what we expected. I literally felt my brain short-circuit. One minute I was processing this major revelation about my son's identity, and the next minute I was trying to wrap my head around the fact that it had all been an elaborate emotional experiment. The whiplash was incredible. My first instinct was to be furious. The relief I'd felt knowing he trusted us enough to share something so personal was instantly replaced by this bewildering mix of emotions I couldn't even name. Part of me wanted to ground him until he was 30 for putting us through that emotional roller coaster. Part of me was impressed by how thoroughly he'd managed to convince us. and part of me was just completely confused about what had actually just happened. But as I sat there staring at my son, who was now fidgeting with his Monopoly piece and looking like he wasn't sure if he should be proud of himself or afraid of getting in trouble, I started to understand what had really been going on. This wasn't some cruel prank or manipulation. This was a 16-year-old kid who had been genuinely worried about whether his parents' love came with conditions attached. The more I thought about it, the more my heart ached for him. What had we done or not done that made him feel like he needed to test our love? Had we been too focused on his grades, his sports performance, his college plans? Had we somehow given him the impression that our pride in him was conditional on his meeting certain expectations? My husband was sitting there with his mouth slightly open, clearly going through his own process of trying to make sense of what had just happened. Our daughter had stopped rolling her eyes and was now watching the whole scene unfold with the kind of fascinated attention she usually reserved for her favorite TV shows. Jake started explaining his reasoning, and I could hear the vulnerability underneath his attempt to sound casual about it. He'd been noticing how much emphasis we put on his achievements lately, the way we bragged about his grades to our friends, how excited we got when he made the team, how we'd been talking more and more about college applications and his future. He'd started wondering if we loved him for who he was or for what he accomplished. He said he'd chosen this particular scenario because it was something that wouldn't hurt anyone but would definitely challenge any conditional love we might have been harboring. He figured if we could accept him being gay without question, then maybe we really did love him just for being himself. The logic was both heartbreaking and brilliant in that uniquely teenage way. He'd essentially conducted a social experiment on his own family to address his deepest fears about belonging and acceptance. It was manipulative, sure, but it was also the desperate action of a kid who needed reassurance and didn't know how else to get it. I found myself thinking about all the conversations we'd had recently about his future, about expectations and goals and making us proud. Had we been sending mixed messages without realizing it? Had our attempts to motivate and encourage him somehow translated into pressure and conditional love? The room felt different now, charged with this new understanding. We weren't just dealing with a prank or a lie. We were dealing with a fundamental question about how our family operated and what messages we'd been sending without even knowing it. Update 2. Over the next few weeks, Jake's test became the catalyst for some of the most honest conversations our family had ever had. Instead of just brushing it off as a teenage prank, we decided to really dig into what had motivated him to feel like he needed to test our love in the first place. It turned out that Jake had been carrying around a lot more anxiety than any of us had realized. He'd been watching his friends deal with parents who seemed to withdraw affection when grades slipped or when kids didn't meet expectations. He'd heard stories about parents who made their love feel conditional on performance, and he'd started wondering if we were doing the same thing without anyone noticing. The more we talked, the more I realized how much pressure we'd been unconsciously putting on him. We'd been so focused on preparing him for success that we'd forgotten to reassure him that our love wasn't dependent on that success. Every conversation about college, every celebration of his achievements, every worried discussion about his future had been building up this fear that he was only valuable to us for what he could accomplish. My husband and I started paying attention to how we talked to both our kids, and it was eye-opening. We discovered we were constantly framing things in terms of achievement and performance. When Jake got a good grade, we'd gush about how proud we were. When he struggled with something, our first instinct was to problem solve rather than just acknowledge his feelings. We meant well, but we were inadvertently teaching him that our approval was tied to his success. Our daughter, who had seemed so unaffected by the whole situation, actually opened up about her own worries. She admitted that she'd been feeling similar pressure, especially watching how we reacted to Jake's achievements. She'd been wondering if she needed to be just as successful to earn the same level of attention and pride from us. It was humbling to realize that our well-intentioned parenting had been creating exactly the kind of anxiety we'd been trying to help them avoid. We thought we were being supportive and encouraging, but we were actually teaching them that love comes with conditions. We started making deliberate changes in how we approached conversations with both kids. Instead of leading with questions about school or achievements, we started asking about their feelings, their interests, their thoughts on random topics. We made sure to express love and affection that had nothing to do with performance or success. But then, just when I thought we were making real progress, Jake threw us another curveball that I absolutely didn't see coming. About a month after the original incident, during another family game night, Jake got that same look on his face again. My stomach immediately dropped because I recognized the signs. He had something else to tell us, and I wasn't sure I was ready for another emotional revelation. This time, he told us that he actually was questioning his sexuality, and that part of his original test had been motivated by genuine confusion about his identity. He hadn't been completely lying. He'd been using the fake confession as a way to gauge our reaction to something he was actually wondering about himself. The kid had essentially been testing the waters by pretending to dive in completely. He'd been curious about how we'd react to the possibility, and when we'd responded with such immediate acceptance and love, it had given him the courage to start exploring those questions about himself more seriously. I felt like I was living in some kind of emotional funhouse where nothing was quite what it seemed. Just when I thought I understood the situation, another layer got peeled back to reveal something even more complex underneath. But this time, instead of feeling manipulated or confused, I felt grateful. Jake had found a way to get the information and support he needed while protecting himself from potential rejection. He'd been smart enough to test our unconditional love before trusting us with something that made him feel vulnerable. Final update. 6 months later, Jake came out to us for real. Not during a dramatic family game night this time, but during a quiet conversation while we were doing dishes together on a random Tuesday evening. He told us he was bisexual, and that he'd been figuring it out gradually over the past year. The conversation was completely different from his original announcement. There was no fear in his voice, no bracing for rejection, no dramatic testing. He was calm and confident, sharing something important about himself with parents he trusted completely. The contrast was striking and showed me just how much our family dynamic had changed. We'd learned to separate our love from our expectations, and Jake had learned that he could trust us with his authentic self. The whole elaborate testing situation had actually been exactly what our family needed, even though none of us had realized it at the time. Our daughter, who by then was 14 and had been watching this whole process unfold, told us she'd learned something important too. She said seeing how we'd handled Jake's questioning and testing had shown her that she could come to us with anything, even if it wasn't what we expected or hoped for. The changes in our family went deeper than just how we talked about sexuality or identity. We'd fundamentally shifted how we approached love and acceptance. We stopped making our pride conditional on achievements and started expressing it based on character, kindness, and authenticity. We learned to celebrate our kids for who they were rather than what they accomplished. Jake's original test had revealed something crucial about conditional love that we hadn't even known we were struggling with. His teenage brain had identified a problem in our family dynamic and found a creative, if emotionally intense, way to address it. Looking back, I'm amazed by how perceptive he was and how effectively he'd managed to create the change our family needed. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the most important conversations happen when we least expect them, and that our kids are often more aware of family dynamics than we give them credit for. Jake had been picking up on subtle cues about conditional love that we hadn't even realized we were sending. Now, our family game nights are actually just about playing games and having fun together. There's no underlying tension, no testing, no performance anxiety. We've learned to express love and pride in ways that aren't tied to achievement or meeting expectations. We celebrate effort, kindness, humor, and authenticity just as much as we celebrate success. Jake is now a confident, self-assured young man who knows he's loved for exactly who he is. He's dating someone he really cares about, and he talks to us openly about his relationships, his fears, his dreams, and his struggles. The trust between us is deeper than it ever was before because it's been tested and proven genuine. Our daughter has benefited from all of this too. She's seen that love in our family doesn't come with conditions, and she's learned to be more open about her own feelings and concerns. She doesn't feel like she has to perform to earn our affection. Sometimes I think about that Friday night when Jake paused mid-Monopoly game and changed everything. At the time, it felt like chaos and confusion. Now I realize it was one of the most important moments in our family's history. Jake had the courage to test something that really mattered, and we had the wisdom to learn from what he was trying to teach us. The whole experience reminded me that parenting isn't just about guiding and teaching our kids. Sometimes they're the ones who have the most important lessons to share with us. Jake's elaborate emotional experiment had shown us something about ourselves that we needed to see, and it had given us the opportunity to become better parents and better people. Looking back, I'm grateful for every confusing, emotional, overwhelming moment of it. Our family is stronger, more honest, and more loving because a 16-year-old boy had the insight to recognize a problem and the creativity to find a solution. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes our kids understand what we need better than we do ourselves.